Okay, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Elayne Ruane, and today on behalf of my co-authors, I will present our paper titled The Forgotten Margins of AI Ethics. So let's begin with the motivation for this work. We contend that AI systems, and in particular systems that automate decision-making, are not just a technical concern, but rather they operate as a socio-technical system. And once deployed, they can meaningfully impact and shape the lives and outcomes for individuals, communities, and society at large. The increase in use of these systems has led to calls for ethical, fair, transparent, accountable ethics practice. And in line with this, the past 4 years in particular have seen rapid growth in the body of AI ethics literature. So in this work, we investigate what, if any, emerging trends occur in this sort of growing body of literature. And specifically, we ask 3 questions. The first is, when scholars discuss issues of fairness, ethics, harm, is it done in an abstract manner, or is it grounded in applications, groups, contexts, and lived experiences? Second question is, do the authors mention particular disparities, such as groups or specific demographics that may be disproportionately negatively impacted by algorithmic systems? And finally, the third question, do authors explicitly name groups or demographics that are harmed, or do they refer to them indirectly or in an implied manner? And I would encourage you to read our paper for a discussion on this rapidly growing field that we see as producing a very diverse body of work that is sort of characterized by a plural, overlapping, sometimes competing, and at times contradictory set of values, methodologies, objectives, goals, and certainly perspectives. And in particular, we focus on the sort of existential tension between ethical perspectives, in particular those with an emphasis on the theoretical and sort of abstract conceptualization, in contrast to those that work from more of a concrete particulars that interrogate systems and historical oppression and challenge existing power asymmetries. So, for greater context for this work, please refer to that discussion in the paper. So here's how we surveyed the field. We read and annotated all papers published in the conference proceedings of FACT, formerly known as FATSTAR, and AIES over the past 4 years, from the founding of the conferences in 2018 to date in 2021. So this resulted in a total of 535 papers, and of those we analyzed 526 papers. And for rating consistency, 91% of papers were annotated by 2 independent annotators. So we developed our annotation scheme in an iterative process, and we finally arrived at 3 measures: concreteness, disparity, and explicitness, or we also refer to it as implicity. And each of those I will now describe. So the concreteness measure is a binary label of either concrete or abstract. And a paper is labeled concrete if the work is grounded in specific applications, demographics, or other context. In contrast, it is labeled abstract if it approaches ethics, and by ethics, we are including bias, fairness, harm, risk, if it approaches that broadly construed ethics from a theoretical or mathematical perspective, and in a manner lacking context of sort of specific impacted groups or demographics. So we use a disparity measure with 5 dimensions to label how a paper investigates, addresses, or otherwise mentions the disparate impacts of an algorithmic system. And we've shortened that here to harm. So a paper is labeled strong if the primary focus of the paper centered around exposing and tackling harm, possibly towards particular groups or classes or demographics. A paper is labeled medium if it engages with disparate impacts in a substantial manner, but it falls short of making such discussion or analysis its primary objective. A paper is labeled weak if it mentions disparate impact of algorithmic systems, but it lacks any significant engagement with the topic. And a paper is labeled agnostic if it does not mention any impact of algorithmic systems on individuals, groups, communities, or demographics. And lastly, a paper is labeled inadequate as a placeholder for several labels, including naive, ill-considered, ill-advised, and anti-equity. So such papers may deal with the topic of disparate impact, but will do so in a way that shows a certain naivete of the topic, or the work may even explicitly enact disparate impacts. So that would be naive and anti-equity, respectively. In terms of ill-advised or maybe ill-considered, papers included in this category may be those that deal with sensitive issues without any discussion of social factors or social impact. So of the papers labeled strong, medium, or weak that mention or engage with disparate impact, they're further labeled with this third measure, this measure of implicity. And so a paper is labeled explicit if it unambiguously names the mentioned or referenced groups or communities or demographics that are disproportionately impacted. A paper is labeled implicit if it discusses or mentions harm or disparate impact without naming specifically the impacted groups or communities. And instead, it deals with harm in an implied, inferred, or otherwise indirect manner. So now that we've established the annotation scheme, we can discuss the results of these 526 annotated papers. So overall, the number of concrete and abstract papers remained relatively proportional for the period of 2018 through 2021. However, we do see some interesting variability among the proportions that are accepted each year, and in particular with those fluctuations for AIES, FACT actually accepted proportionally more concrete papers than AIES in total, but it really did vary year on year. And across the 4-year period that was studied, 71% of papers were labeled agnostic or weak. But we may be seeing the beginning of a trend towards increased numbers of strong and medium papers across both conferences, which is quite encouraging. And this probably is due to a decrease in the proportion of agnostic papers, which is down from 61% in 2018 to just 29% in 2021. So next we can further break down the implicity measure here across the 3 different disparity categories, weak, medium, and strong. So of papers in the weak category, 63% use implicit disparity measures, while those in the medium and strong categories tend to be much more explicit in their discussions of algorithmic harm, unambiguously naming the communities or the demographics that are the focus of the study. We can see on the slide there, the proportions are 76% explicit for papers labeled medium and 89% explicit for papers labeled strong. So of the groups that are explicitly named in the annotated papers, race and gender are by far the 2 most mentioned dimensions of impacted groups, by quite a large margin there as well. So what sort of does this all mean for us? Certainly, I think interesting results, but how can we sort of more broadly contextualize this? When we think of scientific practices, we think of them sort of to a large extent, or at least most often, kind of operating under an apolitical, acontextual manner where the scientist's positionality are rarely, if ever, acknowledged. And for us, in contributing to a scientific practice that acknowledges the inherently political, social, cultural nature of those scientific practices themselves, we as a group of authors reflect on our own views, our values, and our standard for ethics. And in doing so, we don't claim to present our findings in a neutral or otherwise detached manner. But instead, we take a position, excuse me, in the AI ethics landscape, and we put forth this finding informed by that positionality. So we continue to see a hesitancy of the scholarship to move beyond this kind of blind considerations in a way that would directly and explicitly engage with the context that leads to unfairness and disparity, when those disparities are, of course, acknowledged, and we know that they are not always. So our review of the field via the analysis that we've done of the two most prominent conferences shows that there is a tendency for abstract discussion of these topics, and discussion that is devoid of acknowledgement and engagement with the structural and social factors, as well as the specific and potential harms that algorithmic systems can enact or otherwise engage with. We believe this field holds a very crucial and specific place in ensuring that these systems are not, are just and equitable, specifically in bringing to light algorithmic failures and whom they fail, when they fail, as well as in holding responsible bodies and organizations accountable for these failures. And given that the most vulnerable and marginalized in society are the most impacted when we see these failures of algorithmic systems and automated decision-making, we contend that all AI ethics work, from research to policy to governance, all that work should pay attention to structural factors and actual existing harms. So we will end this presentation on that call to action. And I want to say thank you for listening and for your interest in our work. And please feel free to share any questions or comments that you may have. We would love to have those discussions. Thank you very much.